students, it's Dr. Marks. We are here for part 2 of our overview of Thailand. This time we're going to talk about a little bit of history of Thailand. Not a lot. We're not going to go into ancient history, just keep it relatively modern, and then learn a little bit more about the monarchy. So let's get started. Now, in a general history, we need to look at 1939 because prior to 1939, Thailand was known as Siam. Now, at the time, colonial powers were threatening Southeast Asia. Remember, everyone's trying to colonize there. Well, who specifically? Britain, France, but also the United States and the Dutch. They're all there, and they're looking to gain control of territories of Southeast Asia. Interestingly, though, Siam, or modern-day Thailand, was the only Southeast Asian country not taken over by a European country. So read that again. Siam, or Thailand, is the only one of the Southeast Asian countries not taken over by a European country, which means Siam, or Thailand, was never a colony. So we need to ask ourselves, how is it possible that Thailand was never a colony, but everybody else was a colony? Was it because they had this great military and they fought off attacks from, Britain or France or the United States or the Dutch? And the answer is no, that wasn't it at all. It's simply because of an agreement between the French and the British. What kind of agreement between the French and the British? Well, they wanted to create a neutral territory between them, and Siam turned out to be that neutral territory. So let's look at a map and you'll get a better sense of this. Now, here we go. We've got Siam right there with the red arrow, and look at this area in the box. Now we see that the pink area to the left of Siam, Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar, which of course I should be saying Burma because it would have been Burma back then, were British colonies. And then if we look to the right, we've got this French Indochina area in that light blue, but this is modern day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and they were colonized. That area is controlled by the French. So we have the British to the left and the French to the right, and Siam was that neutral territory in between. That's why Siam, or Thailand, was never a colony. But the rest of Southeast Asia was. We've got Indonesia here in yellow, and they were colonized by the Dutch. We see the Dutch East Indies, something you've heard reference to probably many times in your history classes. And then in the red, we've got the Philippines. Most people don't realize that the Philippines was an American colony. So guys, we colonized the Philippines. There's some interesting history there. We're going to ignore ancient history, as I've already said, and we're going to focus a little bit more on the modern day history, starting in 1932, because 1932 is a pivotal year. It's very important in Thai history. 1932 is when there's a bloodless revolution. Now, when we say a bloodless revolution, we're not talking about, the military going to battle, having a war. We're talking about something that did not involve that kind of armed conflict, but instead you have this revolution led by a group called the Promoters. Well, who exactly are the Promoters? Well, they included members of the Thai elite and other well-educated intellectuals, some army officers, so basically a collection of people. But what did they have in common? They were disenfranchised with the idea of monarch rule. They were just basically sick of the idea of monarch rule. Now, as such, the king's overthrown, a temporary constitution is created, and this constitution strips the king of his powers, which put an end to the idea of the absolute monarchy. So let me make sure you're very clear about what I'm trying to say. Before 1932, the country was ruled by the king, and that king had complete power. And when you're an absolute monarch, that means that you're not constrained by a legal system or a constitution. You can basically just do whatever you want. So the individuals who had become disenfranchised with the monarchy were sick of living under an absolute monarchy. And so by overthrowing the king and replacing his powers with constitutions, which basically offers you a legal structure, then you really have changed the nature of the system that's in place in Thailand. So 1932 marks the first written constitution, because before that, no constitution, because it was an absolute monarchy. Since 1932, there have been different constitutions and different governments, but what we see is the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. So in 1932, when we throw out the absolute monarchy, we end up with a constitutional monarchy. Now, you should be able to figure out what that would be. Instead of being an absolute monarchy, a constitutional monarchy would be a monarchy, but you have a constitution. And so we end up with a prime minister who's head of government. You've got prime ministers in other countries as well that have monarchs. So you have a prime minister as head of the government, but the monarch is going to be head of state. So that's the idea of the constitutional monarchy. You've got judicial systems, you've got your legislative branch. So you've got a government structure that would be more familiar to us, more like what we have here, but you still do have a monarchy as head of state. That means there's still a king, but things work a little differently. They don't have absolute power. Now, more recently, Thailand has seen some political turmoil, and that's something we're going to talk a little bit more. For example, we're going to be talking about the idea that if you want foreign direct investment to flow into your country, you need to have some political stability. We're going to talk more about the rice subsidy scheme and the political turmoil that kind of erupted from that. So there's really been some political turmoil in Thailand. And there's recently been a military coup in 2006. Now, with that military coup in 2006, the prime minister is ousted. So they basically ran the prime minister out. And there was lots of tension between political factions, something you'll also learn more about, that there are some really divisive political groups that have caused a lot of problems. There have been huge protests. Sometimes they've gotten very violent. After another political takeover, a second prime minister was ousted. So we've ousted one already. We've ousted another one. And now we have a military affiliated takeover this time. So basically the military becomes in charge of Thailand. And that led to a new constitution. And guys, we're going to be going through this history in a little bit more detail and a little more slowly. So I'm not expecting you to understand, exactly what's taking place and all the dates. We'll cover this, but I'm trying to give you a sense of this political turmoil. So at this point then, after we've run off two prime ministers and the military takes over and we have a new constitution, Thailand was under martial law. But martial law is also not that unusual for Thailand. They've gone under martial law multiple times. And in fact, my group was in Thailand during one of these more recent times when they went under martial law. So you're going to learn more about that. Don't worry. So now we understand that we've got this constitutional monarchy where the monarch is the head of state. So let's talk a little more about the Thai monarchy. Until recently, the throne was held by King Bhumibol, and he took the throne in 1946 and died in 2016. So he was in power for quite a long time, right? I mean, if you add that up, that's a whole lot of years. At the time when he was living, he was the world's longest reigning living monarch. So of all the people that were still alive, he had had the longest reign as king of any king in the world. So not just Thailand, but in the world. Interestingly, King Bhumibol was actually born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where his father studied, because that's the home to Harvard University. So his father was a student at Harvard University. But this must have been an amazing man. He was absolutely revered by most of the country. And when he died in 2016, you can watch videos. I mean, the country was distraught. It was a devastating loss to their citizens. So I imagine that he must have been a fantastic king and a great person, because everything I've ever read has always suggested that to be the case. And you're likely going to still see pictures of him in Thailand, and his face has been on the currency. Here's the currency right here. If you look in the upper right, you see a kind of a younger depiction of the king. He's also on their coins, but you find pictures of him in lots of different buildings, and you might even find him, as you see on the bottom right picture, like on the whole side of a high-rise building. Now, I don't know if at some point they'll remove his picture and replace it with the new king's picture, but since it's the new king is his son, maybe they keep the money reflecting his father's face out of respect. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. One thing that's very interesting concerning the Thai monarchy is that there are lese majesty laws. And Thailand is one of few countries that have lese majesty laws. It's just not that common to have lese majesty laws. Now, if you're not familiar with lese majesty laws, we're talking about laws that relate to an offense against the dignity of a ruling head of state. Let's read that again. An offense against the dignity of a ruling head of state. So that's a more formal definition, but let's pick that apart. An offense against the dignity. So really we're talking about, insulting or criticizing or making somebody look bad of a ruling head of state. Head of state is going to be the king. So it's basically an offense that embarrasses or humiliates the king. So basically what it means is that it's against the law to criticize the monarchy. You cannot openly express your displeasure or disappointment or unhappiness with the king. And in that sense, Thais do not enjoy a freedom of speech as we do here. We can openly criticize anybody in political power, right? If we want to criticize the president, certainly there's been a whole lot of that given our current president, and in our past presidents, we've seen lots of that. And while certainly we have some slander laws where there's cases where you must be careful, you can have some legal liability for just lying about somebody. But if you want to say you don't like the president of the United States, you are free to do that. Well, that's just not a freedom of speech that Thais enjoy when it comes to the monarchy. And in fact, if you do criticize the monarch and you're charged with violation of the lese majesty laws, it's punishable with 3 to 15 years in prison. So imagine going to prison for 15 years for expressing some displeasure or dissatisfaction with your leader. It's hard to imagine given that we have freedom of speech here. Now remember that there was an absolute monarchy until 1932. And that might explain why they still have these laws. The monarchy is entrenched in Thai history. And so for some people, given that the monarchy is so entrenched in Thai history, they see it as a sacred institution. So if you see the monarchy as a sacred institution, it would make sense that you might be in favor of lese majesty laws. Being Americans, it might be hard for us to appreciate lese majesty laws. It might seem truly, unfair and prevent people from being able to openly criticize the monarch. This law that we just talked about was only occasionally used before 2014. I mean, you did see cases, I've read cases, reporters, for example, or somebody who wrote a blog criticizing the monarch. Yeah, they would be charged with violations of the lese majesty laws. But after the 2014 coup, things really changed, and this law was used much more frequently. And there's a Thai watchdog group called iLaw, and they are tracking this, and they report that there have been 98 charges between 2014 and 2018. So just in a 4-year period, there's almost 100 charges where people are accused of violating these lese majesty laws. Some experts say that maybe what this really is about is an excuse to persecute those people opposing military government. So maybe if you're not in favor of this military junta that's taken over in Thailand, you might be criticizing that and you can be charged with the lese majesty laws. So maybe it was used punitively to kind of punish people who weren't in line with supporting the military government. So that's a possibility. But interestingly, in my reading, reportedly, one of these cases was for defaming the former king's dog. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I didn't do any additional research on that. I just thought it was kind of funny, and I thought I'd share that with you. But that does seem maybe like a little bit of a stretch. Now, as we said, King Bhumibol died in 2016, and people were absolutely distraught. But after a 3-year mourning period, his son takes over in 2019. And I have been trying to figure out exactly how you pronounce his name, and I'm not positive I'm going to get it right. So I'm not even going to try butchering it. We'll get our guides in Thailand to tell us the correct pronunciation. So this king, the son of King Bhumibol, is 66 years old at the time, which makes him the oldest Thai king to ever take the throne. So all the other Thai kings took the throne at a younger age. Now, his name means adorned with jewels or thunderbolts. So that's interesting that that's the interpretation of his name. He's got an interesting background. He's a pilot. He's a former officer in the military. He went to prep school in England, and then he went to military college in Australia. And he's an avid cyclist. So on the surface, he seems like a pretty interesting guy. But as you read about him, and there is so much stuff written about him, it also appears he's a bit of a playboy. And that might make him more interesting, but maybe not quite what the Thai people have in mind for a king. And he's also maybe a bit of a wild child. So while he'd probably be pretty interesting to hang out with, it makes you wonder, is he an appropriate king? There are rumors of gambling, illegal businesses, lots of discussion of womanizing. In fact, I read an article that said that during COVID, he went to some other country with 20 women and kind of just, stayed there hanging out with this harem. And his own mother, who is the queen, of course, at the time, commented that her son, as a prince, he was more interested in beautiful women than in his responsibilities. And there are some interesting quotes by her, which is interesting in one sense because she's being very honest, but also she's being open in her criticism of him with reporters. The king's been married 4 times, and in my reading, I found mention of 7 children, but from 3 different women, but not all women that he was married to. So there are some illegitimate children, but currently he's married to his bodyguard, and that was interesting because this was a surprise wedding. She wasn't formally recognized as being his girlfriend by the palace, so they never acknowledged the relationship. So there was kind of a surprise wedding that was sprung on the palace, but Thais do seem to love her. So in that case, it seems like it's worked out. This particular king is also a bit flamboyant. There are lots of pictures of him online with crop tops. That seems to be a typical style of dress that he likes. One in a plane, on a bicycle, walking around. And recently he jailed a 16-year-old boy, again, getting back to these lese majesty laws, because the 16-year-old boy is wearing a crop shirt with the goal of making fun of the king. So again, you're not allowed to do anything that humiliates or embarrasses or criticizes the king, and he's right now, based on my reading, kind of awaiting trial. We'll see what comes of that. But I thought you might be interested in seeing a picture, and these pictures are all over the place. So this is from The Economist, and that is a magazine that's very well known for good economics. Economics professors read this, and you see the king in his crop top. My understanding is that these are temporary tattoos, but again, I just don't know what to say. It just defies logic for me. But that is the king. And by the way, you might be wondering, is he walking around in Thailand looking like this? And the answer is no, because he spends most of his time in Germany, which is interesting. It's unclear to me that Thais feel the same for this king as they did for his father. And again, that makes total sense. His father was absolutely revered in a way that maybe this king is not. But even if they do not revere him like they did his father, there's not going to be a whole lot of open discussion amongst Thais. Remember, The Economist magazine's not a Thai periodical, so there's a lot of discussion about him outside of Thailand, but probably not a lot of open discussion inside Thailand because of the lese majesty laws. So, in conclusion, guys, we've touched on a number of topics. And we're going to take a much deeper dive into some of them, especially things related to politics, because there's just some really interesting stuff that has gone on in Thailand. But if you learned one thing in this lesson, do not insult the monarchy and end up in jail. That would just not be a good way to spend your study abroad days. So, thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Let me know if you have any questions.